Let me tell you something that almost nobody in Western media is talking about. And I think that silence itself is one of the most revealing things happening in geopolitics right now. There is a theory circulating among a very specific group of strategists, foreign policy analysts, and military historians, people who don't usually appear on CNN or BBC. And this theory, if correct, would fundamentally reorder how we understand the Middle East, how we understand American power, and most importantly, how we understand what Iran is actually doing right now. Not what it says it's doing, not what its enemies accuse it of doing, what it is actually doing. And here's the thing about this theory. It's not coming from Iran's adversaries. It's not a threat assessment from the Pentagon, though the Pentagon is certainly aware of it. It's not an Israeli intelligence brief, though Israeli analysts have wrestled with it deeply. This theory is gaining traction precisely because it emerges from people who've spent decades studying Persian strategic culture, the history of the Safavid Empire, the way Iranian leadership thinks about time, not in quarterly reports or election cycles, but in centuries. So before I tell you what the theory is, I want you to hold one question in your mind. And that question is this: what does a country do when it knows it cannot win a direct confrontation, but it also knows it doesn't need to? Stay with that. I've spent a considerable portion of my career studying the relationship between education, ideology, and state power. And one of the things that disciplines you to do when you study these systems seriously is to resist the temptation of the obvious explanation. The obvious explanation is almost always wrong, or at the very least dangerously incomplete. When most people look at Iran today, they see a country that appears to be losing. And on the surface, that is not an unreasonable reading. The October 7th aftermath reshaped the regional calculus in ways Tan did not fully anticipate. Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful non-state proxy, its crown jewel, the instrument of 4 decades of careful investment, suffered devastating losses in southern Lebanon. The Syrian axis, which Iran spent billions and thousands of lives to preserve, collapsed with startling speed when Assad fell. Iranian-backed groups in Iraq have been under unprecedented pressure. The Houthis in Yemen, despite their remarkable ability to disrupt Red Sea shipping, remain strategically contained by any conventional military or geopolitical scorecard. Iran's axis of resistance, the strategic concept that defined its regional posture for the better part of 30 years, is in serious trouble. But here's what the theory says and why it's gaining global attention. What if that's not how Iran's leadership is reading the situation? What if the very framework we're using to evaluate Iran's position, a Western linear military strategic framework, is precisely the wrong lens? To understand this, you need to understand something about Persian strategic culture that most Western analysts consistently underestimate. And I want to be precise here because this is not about cultural essentialism. I'm not saying Iranians think differently because of some mystical Eastern quality. I'm saying that Iran's ruling establishment, the clerical leadership that has governed the Islamic Republic since 1979, has been shaped by a very specific intellectual and historical tradition, and that tradition produces a genuinely different strategic calculus. The Persians have a concept that doesn't translate cleanly into English. The closest approximation is something like patient endurance with purpose. The idea that time itself is a strategic resource, that the measure of strength is not how much force you can project today, but how much structural pressure you can maintain across generations. This is not passivity. This is not weakness. This is a fundamentally different relationship with the timeline of conflict. Think about how the Islamic Republic was born. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 succeeded not because it had superior firepower. It didn't. It succeeded because it outlasted the Shah's ability to maintain popular legitimacy. Think about the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. 8 years of catastrophic conflict in which Iran absorbed staggering losses but ultimately survived. Saddam Hussein, backed by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and virtually the entire international community, could not finish Iran off. The Republic endured, think about 40+ years of sanctions, some of the most comprehensive economic sanctions ever imposed on any nation in history. Iran's economy has been battered, distorted, and stunted. And yet, the Islamic Republic still stands. It has not collapsed. It has not liberalized under pressure the way Western strategists predicted it would. It adapted. This is the first pillar of the theory. Iran's primary strategic goal is not expansion. It is survival and eventual vindication. And survival in the Iranian leadership's mind is not measured in months or even years. It is measured in historical epochs. Now, here's where the theory gets genuinely provocative and where it has started to attract serious attention beyond the usual Iran-watching community. The theory proposes that Iran's current moment of apparent weakness is not a crisis for Tehran's leadership. It is paradoxically closer to an opportunity. Let me explain why. For decades, Iran's strategy of building and maintaining a network of non-state proxies across the Arab world has followed Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis, various Iraq militias served a dual purpose. On one level, these proxies gave Iran strategic depth, the ability to project power and threaten adversaries without direct confrontation. On another level, they gave Iran a kind of political insurance policy. As long as these groups existed and were active, Iran could claim leadership of the so-called resistance to American and Israeli power in the region. It had a role, it had a constituency, but, and this is the critical insight, those proxies also came with enormous costs. They required constant financial investment. They required political capital. They created diplomatic complications. They gave Iran's adversaries legitimate targets to attack and legitimate grievances to mobilize international opinion around. Every time Hezbollah fired rockets into Israel, Iran became more isolated internationally. Every time a Houthi drone struck a Saudi oil facility, Iran absorbed part of the reputational cost. The theory argues that the partial dismantling of this proxy network, painful as it has been, may actually free Iran to pursue a fundamentally different and potentially far more dangerous strategy. A strategy that doesn't rely on militias, doesn't depend on Arab populations that have increasingly ambivalent feelings about Iranian influence in their countries, and doesn't give Iran's enemies a clear target to strike. What is that strategy? It has 3 components, and I want to walk through each one carefully. The first component of this framework is what can be precisely described as nuclear ambiguity, and it is important to distinguish this carefully from the more commonly discussed idea of nuclear weapons development. The argument here is not simply that Iran is steadily progressing toward building a nuclear bomb. That interpretation, while widely circulated, is comparatively straightforward. The more sophisticated claim is that Iran's leadership may have concluded that remaining indefinitely just below the threshold of weaponization, sustaining the threat of nuclear capability without crossing into actual deployment, produces greater strategic advantage than possessing a declared nuclear arsenal. The logic underpinning this position rests on the consequences of overt weaponization. If Iran were to test or openly declare a nuclear weapon, the international response would likely be immediate, severe, and structurally transformative. Israel has repeatedly signaled that a nuclear-armed Iran would constitute an existential red line, and U.S. policy has historically aligned with preventing such an outcome, including the implicit acceptance of military options. A formal Iranian nuclear breakout would almost certainly trigger unprecedented regional realignments, the collapse of remaining diplomatic bridges, and the formation of broad international coalitions aimed at containment or rollback. By contrast, a state that remains perpetually close to the threshold, enriching uranium at high levels, maintaining advanced centrifuge infrastructure, and preserving latent breakout capability occupies a fundamentally different strategic category. It does not bear the full consequences of weapon possession, yet it retains the leverage of potentiality. Every incremental movement toward capability generates crisis pressure. It forces U.S. administrations into repeated decision cycles, compels Israeli strategic planning around preemption, and obliges regional actors such as Gulf Arab states to continuously adjust their security postures. In this reading, the nuclear program is not a pathway to a bomb. The program itself becomes the instrument of power. Its ambiguity, rather than its completion, is the strategic asset. Perhaps most striking is that this form of calibrated ambiguity appears to have produced measurable diplomatic dividends. Across multiple negotiation cycles, Iran has managed to extract concessions, sanctions relief, or partial normalization without committing to permanent constraints on its program. The result is a condition of sustained managed crisis, one that consumes diplomatic bandwidth in Washington, Brussels, and regional capitals while preserving Iran's structural leverage. The second component of the theory is what can be termed an inward strategic pivot, and it may ultimately prove even more consequential than the nuclear dimension. Historically, the Islamic Republic has allocated substantial political, financial, and institutional resources toward external projection of influence. This has been most visible through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' external operations architecture and its coordination of regional proxy networks. Figures such as Qasem Soleimani symbolize the centrality of this outward-facing strategy, in which regional influence operations were not peripheral but foundational to state power. However, the theory suggests that cumulative strategic pressures, regional losses, and shifting constraints are driving or enabling a gradual reorientation of priorities inward. This does not simply imply a reduction in external engagement. It implies a reallocation of state capacity toward internal consolidation. In the Iranian context, internal consolidation is a multidimensional process. It includes reinforcing ideological cohesion within state institutions, deepening the regime's penetration of civil society, and critically developing domestic economic and technological capabilities that reduce dependence on vulnerable external systems. In recent years, Iran has demonstrated notable progress in certain technological domains, particularly unmanned aerial systems and missile development. Some of these advances have had observable impact beyond its borders, including in conflicts where Iranian origin systems have appeared in unexpected ways. Simultaneously, Iran has cultivated a defense industrial base that increasingly emphasizes domestic production and export capability rather than import dependency. From this perspective, the inward pivot is not merely defensive retrenchment. It is a long-term attempt to construct structural resilience. The central implication is that many Western policy frameworks have implicitly relied on a pressure-based model. Sustained sanctions and isolation would eventually force behavioral change or systemic weakening. The inward pivot hypothesis challenges that assumption directly. If Iran can decouple core elements of regime survival from external economic integration by deepening alternative trade relationships, expanding domestic production capacity, and embedding technological self-sufficiency, then the traditional leverage mechanisms of external pressure may gradually lose effectiveness. In that scenario, Iran does not become weaker under pressure. It becomes harder to influence. The third component concerns Iran's evolving role in the regional order, not as a conventional hegemon, but as what can be described as an indispensable complicator. This concept captures a strategic posture that does not require victory in conventional terms, but instead depends on preventing the consolidation of alternative regional architectures that exclude or marginalize Iran. The Middle East is currently undergoing a structural reconfiguration. Initiatives such as the Abraham Accords reflected a broader trajectory toward normalization between Israel and several Arab states, driven by shared security concerns, particularly Iran, and expanding economic alignment with Western systems. Prior to the disruption caused by the October 7 attacks, there was growing momentum toward a regional framework that could have integrated Israel more fully with Gulf powers such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, while collectively constraining Iranian influence. The re-emergence of the Palestinian issue at the center of regional politics significantly altered this trajectory. Regardless of direct causality or intent, the conflict reintroduced a deeply emotive and politically destabilizing fault line into an emerging normalization process. The Palestinian question in the Middle Eastern political imagination is not merely territorial. It is tied to legitimacy, identity, and moral authority across both Arab and broader Muslim publics. Within this environment, Iran's strategic position becomes paradoxical but effective. It does not need to resolve the Palestinian issue, nor does it need to achieve decisive military outcomes through its aligned non-state actors. Instead, the persistence of unresolved conflict itself becomes strategically useful. As long as the Palestinian question remains open and politically salient, it complicates the consolidation of any regional order that seeks to exclude Iran. It allows Tehran to position itself rhetorically and politically as a voice of resistance, enabling it to bypass formal state channels and appeal directly to public sentiment across the region. In this sense, Iran's power lies not in resolution but in obstruction. It does not need to dominate the system. It only needs to ensure that competing regional architectures remain incomplete, contested, or politically fragile. However, any serious evaluation of this theory must acknowledge its internal complications. The first is domestic fragmentation. The Islamic Republic is not a unitary strategic actor. It contains competing institutional centers of power, ideological factions, and bureaucratic interests that do not always converge on a single coherent long-term strategy. Leadership succession, particularly in the context of an aging supreme leader, introduces significant uncertainty regarding continuity of strategic vision and institutional cohesion. Historical transitions within the system have occurred under very different external conditions, and it is not clear that the same degree of internal alignment can be maintained under present volatility. The second complication is economic stress and social pressure. Iran faces persistent structural economic challenges, including inflationary pressures, youth unemployment, and sustained capital and talent outflows. The 2022 protests revealed the depth of generational discontent, particularly among younger populations with limited attachment to revolutionary narratives. This raises a fundamental question: whether a state under sustained domestic strain can simultaneously execute a complex long-term external strategy of the kind described in the inward pivot thesis. The third complication involves external partnerships, particularly with China. While agreements and diplomatic signaling have suggested deepening ties, China's foreign policy behavior remains fundamentally interest-driven and diversified. Beijing maintains substantial economic relationships across the Gulf, Israel, and global trade networks. As a result, its willingness to fully offset Western pressure on Iran is inherently limited and conditional. In certain instances, Chinese priorities may even diverge directly from Iranian regional actions, particularly when disruptions affect maritime or energy routes critical to Chinese economic stability. Despite these contradictions and uncertainties, the theory is gaining traction because it reframes the core analytical question. Instead of asking whether Iran is winning or losing in conventional military or diplomatic terms, it asks what Iran itself defines as success and whether external observers have systematically misunderstood that definition. This shift has significant policy implications. If Iran's strategy is oriented primarily towards survival, ambiguity, and structural entrenchment rather than outright expansion or dominance, then frameworks based on coercion toward capitulation may be fundamentally misaligned with the nature of the system they are trying to influence. Similarly, if nuclear strategy is centered on sustained ambiguity rather than acquisition, and if regional influence operates through disruption rather than control, then conventional containment or negotiation models may consistently produce incomplete or ineffective outcomes. Ultimately, the broader lesson is methodological. Strategic miscalculation in international affairs rarely results from lack of information. It arises from applying the wrong interpretive framework to available data. The prevailing assumption in much Western analysis has long oscillated between viewing Iran as irrational or as a state that can be pressured into systemic change through external force. Yet, decades of empirical outcomes suggest that neither assumption fully captures the logic of the system in question. The alternative interpretation is more unsettling: that Iran's behavior may be strategically rational within its own framework, even if that framework is structurally adversarial to Western expectations. Recognizing that possibility does not imply approval or normalization of its policies. It simply acknowledges that understanding and endorsement are not the same thing. If this emerging theory proves accurate in any meaningful sense, then Iran's trajectory over the coming decade will not be defined by dramatic breakthroughs or collapses, but by gradual consolidation. Sustained nuclear ambiguity, incremental internal strengthening, and persistent regional positioning as an unavoidable variable in any regional order. Whether this represents strategic success or long-term stagnation will depend on how the system evolves, but the more immediate challenge is that it forces a reconsideration of assumptions that have shaped policy for decades.